At approximately 16:45 on the afternoon of August 18, 1993, Captain James Chapo at the controls of his McDonnell Douglas DC-8 began the final challenging turn onto the easterly runway at Leeward Point Airfield at the US Naval Station Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Anxiety on the flight deck was high, due in no small part to the fact that the US military were, and still are to this day, considered unwelcome neighbours by the local Cuban administration. As such, surrounded on all sides, the designated airspace within which the aircraft could manoeuvre for a landing at the base was quite restrictive, in fact very restrictive in the context of the easterly runway, particularly for an aircraft the size of DC-8. Rumour had it that on occasion aircraft which had inadvertently strayed across the international boundary while attempting to land had drawn small arms fire from overly zealous Cuban border guards. As a result, to aid with proper alignment, the border fence was identified by a flashing strobe light mounted atop a US military observation tower. To ensure no harm came to either them or other aircraft, pilots were prohibited from deviating to the west of the strobe light under any circumstances, lest they trigger an ugly international incident. Preoccupied with trying to locate the strobe, Chapo's attention drifted from what should have been his first priority, that being his handling of the aircraft. The approach even without distraction was going to be challenging, to say the least, but with his attention divided, Chapo's turn onto final was late and commenced far too close to the runway itself. Thus, in an effort to compensate and tighten the turn, the captain did what every student pilot is warned not to do. He pulled back on the control column while simultaneously applying rudder in order to get around the corner. With airspeed decaying despite the attempted verbal intervention of his flight engineer, the aircraft subsequently entered an accelerated stall spin, rolling and descending rapidly until impact with the ground some quarter of a mile or almost half a kilometre equivalent from the approach end of runway 10. So what had gone wrong? Yes, the aircraft had stalled, a fact which was established early on in the investigation. But why had Chapo and his crew, with more than 41,000 hours of flying experience between them, come to make such a fundamental handling error? And, onto that runway in particular, when other less challenging options had actually existed? The answers to these questions would inevitably unearth the truths about some rather unsavoury industry practices in the US at the time. Examples of opportunistic regulatory interpretation, poor oversight, and a pervasive culture of toxic work practices and poorly disguised crew intimidation. To understand more and fully appreciate how each played their part in the disaster at Guantanamo, stay with me as I uncover the complete story behind the accident of American International Airlines Flight 808.
Calling out Mayday.
Neither Captain Chapo, his first officer Tom Curran, or his flight engineer Dave Richmond were ever actually scheduled to be in Guantanamo that August afternoon, Wednesday 18th. Indeed, neither was the accident aircraft, which was listed on the US registry as November 814 Charlie Kilo, a DC-861 series derivative. To understand how and why all had found themselves to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's necessary to start our story some 2 days earlier in Atlanta, Georgia, on the night of Monday, August 16th. Chapo and Curran had arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport that night just prior to 2300 local, in order to commence a 4-day sequence of flights that would have them crisscross the country from south to north and back, slipping freight through the company's headquarter facilities at Ypsilanti on the outskirts of Detroit, Michigan. Richmond, being based in Ypsilanti, would join Chapo and Curran there after their arrival. So for now, the initial sectors north would be crewed by a completely different flight engineer who would ultimately play no part in the subsequent sequence of accident events. With the aircraft loaded and all cockpit pre-flight duties completed, November 814 Charlie Kilo, operating under the call sign of Connie 860, departed Atlanta just a few minutes after midnight, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina, an intermediate stop en route to its final destination. The company operating the DC-8 that evening had originally been founded back in 1967 as Connie Kalitta Services, being named for its founder Conrad Connie Kalitta, an accomplished Michigan businessman, pilot and drag racer. During its earlier years, the business had focused on ferrying car parts across the Midwest, using a twin-engine Cessna 310, which Connie himself had piloted. Moving on a few years, and in the early 1980s, the American International Airways brand name was to become associated with a separate charter and scheduled passenger airline based in Philadelphia, essentially serving destinations along the East Coast and into the Midwest. Although eventually ceasing operation in the latter part of 1984, Connie continued to incorporate the brand as Kalitta American International Airways on its cargo-only flights right up until 1997, some 4 years after the accident. Indeed, during the latter parts of the 1980s, the Kalitta brand name was to appear on many of the company's cargo aircraft, including Charlie Kilo, the aircraft being operated this evening. During that same decade, the company's fleet had grown significantly from its humble beginnings to include types such as the Boeing 747, the Lockheed L-1011, and of course the McDonnell Douglas DC-8, with the range of services being provided also having grown and diversified significantly. November 814 Charlie Kilo had been manufactured in December 1969, making it just under 14 years old at the time of the accident. Originally configured for passenger service, in 1991 it had been sold to American International Airlines and converted to a freighter. As the DC-8 made its way across the largely empty skies towards Charlotte, Chapo and Curran busied themselves with the routine tasks of navigation and radio communication. Chapo, age 54, was an extremely experienced pilot with nearly 21,000 hours of total time under his belt. A 25-year veteran of Eastern Airlines, he had previously flown the Lockheed L-1011, DC-9 and 727 types, while subsequently joining American International Airways in 1991. Of his impressive 21,000 total hours, just over 4,500 had been obtained on the DC-8. To his right, First Officer Curran, age 49, had been hired by the company in November 92, a mere 10.5 months prior to the accident. Likewise, his piloting history had included a 23-year spell at Eastern, where he had flown as flight engineer, first officer and captain on a diverse number of aircraft types. His total time extended to just over 15,000 hours, which included 492 hours on the DC-8 with American International, where he had flown as both the first officer and captain. Both men were widely respected by their peers as competent professionals. Having transited through Charlotte, the DC-8 was soon airborne again, finally arriving without incident into Willow Run Airport, Ypsilanti, just after 4 a.m. in the early morning hours of August 17th. Parked up with the engine shut down, the original flight engineer, per the crew's schedule, said his goodbyes and departed for home. Chapo and Curran gathered their belongings and in leaving the aircraft walked the short distance across the ramp to board the neighbouring machine, registered as November 802 Charlie Kilo, where they met their newly assigned flight engineer Dave Richmond, who had just been caught on reserve and was already busy preparing the jet for departure. Richmond, age 35, unlike Curran, had flown with Chapo before. In a similar vein to his captain, he had joined American International 2 years earlier in 91, having amassed a total of just over 1,000 hours on the panel of the DC-8 during that time. This contributing to his experience total of just over 5,000 hours. Again, he was described by his peers as competent and conscientious, with many remarking that he was the type to speak up if observing anything unusual or out of the ordinary. As the hours dragged on and the freight loads eventually got sorted, Chapo, Curran and Richmond, this time flying under the call sign of Connie 841, departed Ypsilanti some 3.5 hours after their arrival from Charlotte, bound this time for Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas, with an en route intermediate stop at St. Louis, Missouri. The time was now 7:46 local. 4.25 hours later, Connie 841 finally arrived in Dallas, and as they parked up the jet and prepared to head to a local hotel for some much-needed sleep, The clock would show that both Chapo and Curran had been on duty now for a total of 13 hours, just over 5.5 of which had been in the operating seat. Richmond, having just joined them in Ypsilanti, had worked an obviously shorter shift of 7 hours, 3 of which had been physically at his station in the cockpit. The accident at Guantanamo was now approximately 28 hours into the future. At about 2200 that same evening, the trio met in the foyer of the hotel in order to take transport back to the airport. Reporting for duty at 2300, their rest period between flights had lasted a full 11 hours. Boarding the same aircraft they had brought in earlier that same day, with the process of loading and preparing the flight for departure now complete, once again Chapo and his crew were airborne, departing Dallas Fort Worth at midnight on the 17th as Connie 840 bound again for Ypsilanti, with an en route stop this time in St. Louis. Arriving in Ypsilanti at 3:25 a.m. on the morning of the 18th, all 3 crew members deplaned, again crossing the ramp to reboard what eventually would be the accident aircraft, November 814 Charlie Kilo. Yet their destination wasn't Guantanamo, but rather back to Atlanta, where their rotation had commenced 2 days earlier. And so at 6:20 a.m, about 3 hours after their arrival, Chapo, Curran and Richmond were airborne once again, this time as Connie 861. The accident at Guantanamo was now approximately 10.5 hours into the future. 861 touched down in Atlanta at 7:52 local, on the morning of August 18th, the day of the accident. Their published rosters showed that the crew were now clear of duty until 2300 later that same day, a rest period which would equate approximately to 15 hours. Richmond left for a company-provided hotel room in order to get some sleep. However, both Curran and Chapo, both being domiciled in the Atlanta area, decided to independently spend some time with family. While Curran stayed at the airport in order to meet with some family members, Chapo had decided to leave and drive the relatively short distance home in order to catch up with family and get some rest. Remember, these being the days before mobile phones, Chapo called his wife from a payphone at a nearby gas station while en route to let her know he was on his way. She, however, had some rather unwelcome news. She had just been contacted by a company representative from the scheduling department, inquiring as to Chapo's whereabouts. They had left a message for her to pass on as soon as possible, requesting that he return immediately to the airport. Arriving back at Hartsfield, the captain learned that a similar message had been passed to both his first officer and flight engineer, who had likewise been recalled. Apparently 660 miles further south in Miami, one of the company's other DCA freighters had developed a technical problem, which had been significant enough in nature so as to cause it to be withdrawn from service for repair. This was causing a serious logistical headache. That aircraft, registration November 808 Charlie Kilo, was supposed to operate a rotation as Connie 808 from Miami to the Naval Air Station at Norfolk, Virginia, uplifting supplies of mail, perishable goods and reportedly submarine parts, all of which were to be flown to the US military base at Guantanamo Bay. The sortie was being conducted under a long-standing contract that American International had with the US Department of Defense. Indeed, historically, the company had had a significant working relationship with the US military down through the years, and had, during the years of 1990 and 91, operated more than 600 missions in support of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So, that being the case, given the unserviceability of the scheduled aircraft, if they would be unable to fulfill their contractual obligations, it would not only be damaging to the company's reputation, but it would also come with a hefty fine, neither of which was desirable. And that's where Chapo and his crew were to come in. Given the circumstances, despite the original plan to have them rest up before that evening's duty, they now learnt that they had instead been rescheduled in order to address the company's growing problems in Miami. The plan was now for them to take the very same aircraft which they had just brought into Atlanta, that being November 814 Charlie Kilo, and fly it to Norfolk empty. Once there, they were to wait while the freight in question was loaded before flying it onward to Guantanamo, per the original scheduled plan, after which they were to ferry the aircraft back again empty to Atlanta, thus getting the aircraft back into its correct position for its subsequent rotations later that same night. According to the crew scheduler, this revised assignment would increase both Chapo's and Curran's flight times by about an additional 6.5 hours, confidently seeing the proposed operation complete within the company's maximum 24-hour crew duty day policy. He subsequently stated that he saw no difficulty with the length of the duty, despite the fact that the crew had already been up for most of the night beforehand, because the leg to Guantanamo was seen as an operation to an international destination, while the return leg from Guantanamo back to Atlanta, being an empty positioning flight, fell into an altogether different category of operation with its own unique duty limitations. Cherry-picking therefore from 3 different sets of regulations relating to domestic, international and positioning operations, he had thus cobbled together a patchwork of rules and applied them in a uniquely interpreted manner in order to supposedly keep the operation legal. Specifically, to explain what his intention was. Under Federal Aviation Regulations Parts 121 and 135, which govern the operation of scheduled and charter airlines from a US domestic perspective, the applicable flight duty limitations stated that no single duty period could extend beyond a continuous 24 hours, within which no more than 8 hours could be spent by a pilot in his or her operating seat. As the flight time from Atlanta to Norfolk would be a relatively short hour and a half, this time in the seat, in addition to what the crew had already accumulated during the previous night's work, would still see them comply with these regulatory stipulations. But given the much longer duration on the onward trip to Guantanamo, it was going to be problematic. So in order to work around the problem, American International simply embraced a completely different set of rules. A separate paragraph within the regulations of 121 and 135 specifically addressed international operations, these being operations to or from destinations outside of the US. Under these circumstances, while crews were still restricted to the absolute maximum duty time of 24 hours, that portion which related to actual time spent in an operating seat was extended from the previous 8-hour limitation for domestic operations to a revised maximum of 12 hours. Given the fact that the Naval Air Station at Guantanamo was located in the Caribbean, despite being sovereign US territory, the company had chosen to invoke this particular paragraph, declaring the operation to be international in nature. In so doing, the flight time to Guantanamo will be incorporated within the stipulated 12-hour period, thus eliminating the problem of getting to the naval base. But again, even using this less conservative rule, getting home from Guantanamo was once more going to be problematic, unless the crew were to park up and take appropriate rest at the base before returning to Atlanta. This, however, was seen as unacceptable, as to do so would seriously disrupt the following day's operation from Atlanta, which most probably would have repercussions throughout the operation for a far greater extended period of time. No, once the freight had been unloaded in Guantanamo, some legitimate way would have to be found in order to get the aircraft back to Atlanta, ASAP. What the company thus proposed was that for the return flight to Atlanta, given that the aircraft would be positioning empty, the flight would be classified as operating under rules governed by Federal Aviation Regulations Part 91. To be clear, the spirit of Part 91 regulations apply to general aviation or private operations, typically akin to the operation of a Cessna 172 or Piper Cherokee, not anything the size or complexity of a McDonnell Douglas DC-8. Yet this is what was being proposed, which to say was a stretch was a monumental understatement. Why Part 91? Well, operations conducted under this particular paragraph of legislation stipulate no flight time duty limitations whatsoever, which, if you think about it, is not really all that surprising, given that operation of a complex multi-crew aircraft was never envisaged under these rulings. And so, in theory, given that the company had arbitrarily designated this return sector to Atlanta as a private positioning of their aircraft, the crew could technically now keep going until they literally collapsed from exhaustion. And that, from a company perspective, eliminated all of their operational headaches in one foul swoop. The crew scheduler testified that he was familiar with all three members of the crew, adding that he had called upon them numerous times over the past year for overtime assignments, which they had typically accepted. This time, however, Chapo wasn't so easily convinced. He, Curran and Richmond had taken some time to examine what was being proposed, and although all testified that at the time they didn't feel particularly tired, they were nonetheless collectively of the opinion that what was being proposed was, to use their own words, pushing the edge. Reluctantly, being convinced by the scheduler's arguments, and in Curran's own words and understanding amongst them that you better really be tired in order to refuse a trip, all three had agreed to push on. November 814 Charlie Kilo thus departed Atlanta at 10:10 on the morning of the 18th, arriving in Norfolk an hour and a half later at 11:40. Upon arrival, Chapo exchanged greetings with the freight handler and then proceeded to the station office in order to obtain a revised flight plan for the intended trip to Guantanamo. They were observed by base personnel to have reviewed and studied the new flight documentation, which included proposed weight and balance information and applicable weather forecasts for the intended route of flight down to the Caribbean. Although Curran had, between the years of 63 and 68, operated as a US Navy pilot in and out of the base on a semi-regular basis, in the intervening 25 years or so he hadn't been back, which was still considerably better statistics than those of Chapo or Richmond, both of whom would be making the trip for the very first time. With their freight load on board, Chapo and his crew began their taxi from the ramp at 14:05 local under the call sign of Connie 808, some 2.5 hours after their arrival, getting airborne 8 minutes later at 14:13, bound for Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The naval base at Guantanamo, affectionately called Gitmo by those stationed there, is located on a small parcel of sovereign US land and sea covering just 45 square miles on the southeasternmost tip of Cuba. The original decision by the Cuban government to lease the area to the United States as a coaling station and naval base was formalised by way of written agreement between the two parties way back in 1903, with no specific termination date being set out. The terms of the lease stipulated that the United States would pay the equivalent of $2,000 in gold per year, and this continued up until 1934, at which time the US government unilaterally changed the payment terms to an equivalent cash amount. These payments have been sent annually by the US government to Havana, but only one lease payment has ever been accepted since the Cuban Revolution of 1959, with Fidel Castro claiming that this check was deposited in error due to confusion at the time. Since taking power in 1959, the Cuban Communist government has consistently protested against the US presence on Cuban soil, arguing that the base was imposed on Cuba by force and is thus illegal under international law, hence the presence of trigger-happy border guards and the resultant protracted approach procedures for all arriving traffic, who must at all costs avoid overflying Cuban sovereign territory, illustrating the necessity and importance of these supply flights. With no stipulated termination date, the lease can only be ended if the US Navy decides to abandon the area, or both countries agree mutually to its termination. And given the geographical importance of the base to the US authorities, one would surmise that that isn't going to happen anytime soon. The airfield at the base was officially named Leeward Point, and consisted of a single runway orientated east-west, 8,000 feet in length. As the overflight of Cuban territory while approaching the base was, and still is, prohibited for both US military and Department of Defense charters such as American International, The resultant approaches to both the easterly and westerly ends of the single runway were somewhat protracted. Of the two, the approach to the westerly runway 28 was by far the less challenging. Aircraft would remain a sufficient distance offshore in international airspace until such time as they were able to take up an intercept heading for the extended runway centreline. The reciprocal easterly approach to runway 10, however, was considerably more difficult, given its much closer proximity to the Cuban border. Shooting this approach meant ensuring visually that the aircraft didn't stray across the international boundary, while simultaneously navigating the aircraft around a very tight turn to line up with the runway centreline barely seconds before touchdown. And so, with Chapo the designated handling pilot for the Sector South, it was Curran who had made contact with the Guantanamo radar controller at 16:34 local time, while the aircraft was descending through 32,000 feet. Over the following 3-minute period, there were several exchanges between the aircraft and the approach controller, the last of which came with the instruction:
Connie 808 Heavy, Guantanamo radar. Maintain VFR 12 miles off the Cuban coast. No reported traffic in the area. Report East Point. Leeward Field is landing runway 10, wind 180 at 8. Altimeter is 299er7.
East Point referred to the first of 3 position fixes identified by a bearing distance from the Guantanamo VOR navigation beacon. These points, acting as metaphorical breadcrumbs, would ensure the aircraft safely rounded the easternmost tip of the island through international airspace and onward towards the base itself. As the aircraft descended through 22,000 feet, Curran, as requested, passed his report that Connie 808 had indeed now passed East Point. The time was now 16:38. Chapo and his crew were now a mere 18 minutes away from disaster. With the surface wind having been reported as 100 degrees 8 knots, this would have resulted in an almost imperceptible headwind component of just 1 knot when landing on runway 10, which, not surprisingly, would have equated to an equally slight tailwind component onto the reciprocal 28 end. As with all tailwind landings, this option would have introduced a slight performance penalty, but one which would have posed absolutely no difficulties whatsoever for the DC-8, were the crew to request this alternative. And given the complexity of the 10 approach and the relative size of their aircraft, this was most probably the more sensible of all options available. However, just 14 minutes prior to the accident, at 16:42, Chapo addressed the other members of the crew.
We ought to make that 10 approach just for the heck of it, to see how it is. Why don't we do that? Let's tell him we'll take 10. If we miss, we'll just come back around and land on 28.
This was followed by Curran contacting the approach controller and confirming their intention to shoot the approach onto runway 10. In acknowledging their request, she in turn queried the direction of the preferred turn onto final approach.
You want a left or right entry?
Curran replied.
We'll make a right-hand entry. Thanks.
Yet despite Curran's apparently confident reply, doubts about the approach procedure were obviously still present in Chapo's mind.
It does say right traffic in that training clip. That's all it says, right?
Right. I know for sure because I just went through recurrent. Besides, there's a big hill over there. It might end up giving you some depth perception problems.
At 16:46, just 10 minutes prior to the accident, Connie 808 was transferred to the tower controller at Guantanamo.
Connie 808, good afternoon. Runway 10, wind 200 at 7, altimeter 299er7, report Point Alpha.
Curran again acknowledged the controller's transmission and requested further clarification as to the location of Point Alpha, once more growing evidence of their unpreparedness for what was starting to unfold. In providing the requested clarification, critically, just seconds later, the controller made a proposition which, if accepted, would have completely negated the carnage which was about to follow.
808, would you like runway 28?
Yet despite her helpful intervention, the crew of 808 remained resolute.
Thanks, but we're going to try 10 first.
And so at 16:47, just 9 minutes before the accident, Chapo began the final approach sequence for runway 10, with selection of flap 15 and his calling for the approach checklist. 5 minutes later, Curran was heard prompting Chapo to continue with his configuration of the aircraft in preparation for his final turn towards the runway. Then came the standard obligatory statement from the tower controller, reminding them one last time of the requirement to stay well clear of Cuban airspace.
Connie 808. Cuban airspace begins 3/4 of a mile west of the runway. You are required to remain within the airspace designated by a strobe light.
To which Curran replied.
Roger, we'll look for the strobe light.
Curran then turned to Chapo and was heard to comment,
I'd give myself plenty of time to get straight. Maintain a little water off, because you're gonna have to turn. I think you're getting in close before you start your turn.
indicating that from his perspective, Curran believed that Chapo needed to widen out the approach slightly if he was to have any chance of being successful with the turn from base onto final. Chapo replied,
Yeah, I got it. Gonna have to really honk it. Let's get the gear down.
Events were now beginning to happen at a pace. During the next several seconds, Chapo was recorded stating to the other crew members that he was having difficulty identifying the runway environment as they approached the airport and as the wing flaps were being lowered into their final 50-degree position.
Now we gotta stay on one side of this road here, right?
Curran replying,
Yeah, we gotta stay on this side. On this side over here, you can see the strobe lights.
At 16:52, just 4 minutes before the accident, Richmond, from his position to the rear of the cockpit and monitoring the flight's progress, noticed the jet's indicated airspeed start to bleed off. In an effort to draw the pilot's attention to this most critical change in circumstance, he called out,
Low airspeed!
Yet Chapo and Curran were becoming far too engrossed with what was happening outside of the aircraft to have been able to process the full gravity of Richmond's warning.
Check the turn.
As the shoreline was fast approaching, anxiety levels in the flight deck noticeably increased.
Where's the strobe?
Right over there.
Where?
Right inside. There.
While Chapo and Curran became even more fixated with trying to locate the strobe light, Richmond once again sounded the alarm in relation to the jet's airspeed.
You know, we're not getting our airspeed back there.
His interjection, however, yet again failing to make any impression on the pilots up front. Chapo again called out,
Where's that damn strobe?
with Curran's responses getting all the more agitated.
Right down there.
I still don't see it.
All the while, Richmond becoming more and more concerned about the aircraft's trajectory.
Fuck! We're never gonna make this!
Where's the fucking strobe?
Right over here. You think you're gonna make this?
Yeah, if I can catch the strobe light.
Richmond, still focused on the jet's airspeed, yet again attempted to grab the pilot's attention.
Watch it! Keep your airspeed up!
As Chapo continued to roll the aircraft aggressively into the turn, 3 seconds later the DC-8 stall warning was triggered, with a collective simultaneous outcry from both Richmond and Curran. Having lost control of the jet at such low altitude, the possibility of Chapo recovering the situation before impact with the ground was, to be blunt, simply impossible. The DC-8 impacted the ground some 1,400 feet short of the runway threshold, exploding in a fireball as it did so. A C-130 military aircrew, from their vantage point on the ramp, witnessed the DC-8 turn finals, and recalled 808's last moments as this.
I saw the DC-8 on a wide base for runway 10. It appeared to be approximately 1,000 feet above ground level. I was interested in watching such a large aircraft shoot the approach. It looked to me as if it was turning to final rather late, so it surprised me to see him at 30 to 40 degrees angle of bank, trying to make the turn. At about 400 feet above ground level, he increased the bank angle still further to about 60 degrees in an effort to make the runway, but was still overshooting. At this time, the aircraft's nose turned right, and it appeared that he was trying to use bottom rudder. I suppose at this stage he was about 200 to 300 feet above the ground. He was still overshooting, and my co-pilot remarked that he was going to land on the ramp. His wings started to rock towards wings level as the nose pitched up. At this point, the right wing appeared to stall. The aircraft rolled 90 degrees to the right, and the nose rapidly pitched down.
In order to fully understand what's just happened, we're going to have to take a quick dive into the world of aerodynamics. Now, first thing though is to relax. It's at about this stage that people begin to switch off and glaze over. But if you stay with me for just a few short minutes, I promise to explain what's going on here in as simple and uncomplicated a manner as I possibly can. For an aircraft in undisturbed flight, 4 distinct forces are acting on the airframe all at the same time. Firstly, the effect of gravity on the aircraft's physical mass will result in a downward weight vector. Secondly, while in straight and level flight, this weight vector is countered by a lift vector, this lift being produced by the wings. Thirdly, In order to propel the aircraft forward, the engines produce a thrust vector, which in turn is itself countered by the fourth and final force acting on the aircraft, that being drag. To explain in detail how Connie 808 ended up as a smoking hole in the ground, of all the forces involved, let's pay particular attention to the lift vector. Now here's the slightly painful bit, but again bear with me. The lift being produced by the wing can be mathematically expressed by the equation half rho v squared SCL. This looks somewhat intimidating, but believe me, it really isn't. All that the equation is saying is that the amount of lift being produced depends on a number of factors. The density of the environment where the aircraft is flying, that being rho, the speed at which the relative airflow is passing over the wing surface, that being v, the physical area of the wing surface, that being represented by the letter S, and the aerodynamic characteristics of the wing itself, in particular and of huge importance, the wing's angle of attack, that being expressed here as CL. As we've just stated, in level flight, the total lift produced by the wings, shown here by the orange line labelled LT, will balance the effect gravity is having on the mass of the aircraft, namely its weight, represented by the blue line and labelled WT. Now as the aircraft begins to turn, which is exactly the scenario we're talking about with Connie 808, the total lift will be orientated out of the vertical. One way to think of this is that the total lift vector will always act in a direction, which is a straight line from the pilot's feet through his head, with the degree to which it's moved out of the vertical being predicated on the angle of bank being flown. The greater the bank angle, the more the total lift vector is displaced. So why is this important? Well, once orientated out of the vertical, the total lift vector will no longer be able to directly counter the weight vector. In fact, the only thing attempting to balance the weight vector in this case is the residual lift vector, shown here as LR, which is that remaining portion of the total lift vector which is still having an influence in the vertical plane. As can be seen from these three diagrams, the greater the angle of bank, the more the total lift vector is displaced out of the vertical, and the smaller the magnitude of the resulting lift vector. And this can only mean one thing. As the magnitude of the resultant lift vector decreases, there quickly comes a point where it can no longer balance the weight vector, and thus the aircraft will start to descend. So how would this have manifested itself on the flight deck of the DC-8? Chapo, due to his fixation with trying to locate the strobe light, was late in executing the turn onto finals. As he effectively ran out of room, he attempted to tighten up the turn by applying more and more aileron, bringing the aircraft to completely inappropriate bank angles, in excess of 60 degrees. For the reasons already mentioned, this would have had a significant adverse impact on the residual lift vector, to the extent that from his perspective, the nose of the aircraft would have started to drop through the horizon, with an associated increase in the aircraft's rate of descent. Instinctively and most probably without conscious thought, Chapo would have applied back pressure to the control column in order to stop the nose dropping, and indeed return it to its original starting point. But such action has consequences, serious consequences. What Chapo was subconsciously trying to do was grow the magnitude of the resultant lift vector. However, as it is merely a byproduct, so to speak, of the total lift vector, it's actually it which needs to grow in order that a corresponding increase in the resultant vector can be realised. Now, if we go back to the original lift equation, how is that actually achieved? If we assume the values of density, speed, and area of the wing don't change over the relatively short period of time we're talking about, then the only way we can increase the magnitude of the total lift vector is to increase the value of CL, or in layman's terms, the wing's angle of attack. So the important takeaway here is that in the turn, as the pilot pulls back on the control column, in an effort to control the aircraft's rate of descent, he or she is actually increasing the aerodynamic loading on the wing, and in so doing is actually increasing the angle of attack. Problem solved, I hear you say. Well, yes and no. From the graph it can be seen that as the angle of attack increases, this being shown along the x-axis, the lift being produced by the wing, shown along the y-axis, will likewise increase, but importantly only to a point. This point of maximum lift, referred to as CL max, defines the critical angle of attack. At angles of attack above this value, the airstream over the wing is physically no longer capable of following the curvature of the wing surface, and it effectively breaks away. The lift being produced by the wing at this point rapidly decreases, and the wing is said to have stalled. It's important to reinforce the point here that airspeed, or lack of it, doesn't in itself result in the aircraft stalling. As airspeed decreases and the pilot compensates while attempting to maintain lift on the wing, it is definitively the angle of attack exceeding the critical value which will result in the stall, and nothing else. To prove the point, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that 808 had a stall speed in straight and level flight of 100 knots. If every effort was made to maintain this speed using appropriate amounts of engine power as the aircraft started to turn, look what happens to the stall speed as the bank angle increases. It also increases. So at 60 degrees angle of bank, which is pretty much the territory 808 found itself in, the stall speed would no longer be 100 knots, but rather 40% more, that being 140 knots. Why? Because stall is a function of angle of attack, not airspeed. As Chapo rolled the aircraft into the turn, even if he had been maintaining the correct constant airspeed, what he was actually doing was consistently pulling on the control column, thus closing the gap towards the critical angle of attack. This is what's termed an accelerated stall. Thus, if that constant approach speed had have been 135 knots, well, you can see where the problem lies. As the aircraft approached 60 degrees of bank, this airspeed would have been insufficient to produce enough lift in itself to keep the aircraft flying. The lift equation would state that some other factor would have to come into play in order to augment the lift being lost at such a high angle of bank. And with all other values of the lift equation remaining constant, that could only have been done by ever increasing the aircraft's angle of attack. But again, as we've demonstrated, push that too far and you're in trouble, big trouble. And so to a crew flying this hypothetical scenario, they would have experienced the aircraft stall as the bank angle rolled through about 56 degrees, assuming that the pilot was applying back pressure to the control column while aerodynamically loading the wing in an effort to stop the nose of the aircraft falling. So what have we got so far? In rolling the aircraft into the turn, the lift on the wings was reduced, as a result being unable to now support the weight of the aircraft fully. The nose dropped and the rate of descent increased. To counteract, Chapo had pulled back on the control column, but in doing so, he was continuously increasing the wing's angle of attack, getting closer and closer to the critical angle of attack the more the aircraft banked. But this wasn't the only factor which was working against Chapo. In the example so far, I've deliberately assumed that airspeed was maintained as a constant. But you'll remember that on more than one occasion Richmond had attempted to draw the pilot's attention to the fact that the airspeed was bleeding off, a depleting energy state which Chapo had failed to address before commencing the turn. Hopefully from my explanation so far, you can see why Richmond was so concerned. If you revert back once again to the lift equation, look what happens to the angle of attack CL as the airspeed V decreases. Assuming that none of the other values change, as indeed was the case with 808. In order to maintain the same amount of lift, the angle of attack will have to increase as the speed decreases. So Richmond's concern was that even before the turn commenced, the angle of attack was starting to increase, meaning that they were already on the back foot, so to speak, even before they started to apply bank. Furthermore, while an increase in angle of attack increases the lift produced by the wing, up until the point where we reach the critical value, there is also a corresponding increase in drag. This additional drag will cause the airspeed to reduce still further unless the pilot compensates by adding additional power. Where no or insufficient power is applied to compensate for the increasing drag, the further reduction in airspeed will only act to drive the angle of attack still higher, continuously reducing the margin to the critical value. So what we know now is that the intended turn onto final was always going to reduce the margin to the critical angle of attack. This fact was compounded because Chapo, distracted by his attempts to visually acquire the strobe light, had commenced the turn late, meaning he was forced to fly the aircraft at inappropriate bank angles while attempting to make the turn without going through the centerline. Bad and all as this scenario was, the situation had been made considerably worse by Chapo allowing the airspeed to bleed off even before he started the turn, meaning that from the outset the angle of attack was already higher than it should have been. Yet all that said, there was still one more significant factor which was to work against them. The eyewitness reports from the US naval crew on the ramp made significant reference to the fact that it looked like Chapo was applying bottom rudder as he came around the corner. If this was the case, although the final report doesn't definitively say so, it would have been the last nail in the coffin for him and his crew. Let me explain. In starting the turn late, we've already established that Chapo had gradually increased the aircraft's angle of bank to a ridiculous amount in order to tighten the turn. One other additional technique which pilots often employ in order to achieve the same result is to apply rudder in the direction of the turn, also known as bottom rudder, with the intention once again being to tighten up or reduce the radius of turn itself. Every student pilot from day one of his flying career is told, however, that such a technique is fraught with danger. As Chapo applied rudder into the turn, two things would have happened. Firstly, the application of rudder will initially cause the nose of the aircraft to yaw in the direction of the rudder input. What that means in this specific context is that as Chapo applied right rudder, the nose of the aircraft would have swung to the right, with the aircraft rotating about its vertical axis. Secondly, as a consequence of this yaw, the aircraft would have rolled to the right, increasing the bank angle still further, thus requiring Chapo to apply still more back pressure to the control column in order to stop the nose from dropping, and in so doing further reducing the aircraft's margin to the critical angle of attack. But it's in the detail as to why the aircraft will roll, wherein lies the hidden danger of this particular handling technique. Again, back to the general lift equation. As the aircraft yaws to the right in this instance, relatively speaking, the left-hand wing will precess or move forward, while the right-hand wing will recede or appear to move backwards. This action will have a direct influence on the magnitude of the airflow over the wing's surface, such that as the left-hand wing moves relatively forward, the local value of V will tend to increase, while on the right-hand wing, with its relative movement rearward, its local value of V will conversely tend to decrease. From the equation it can be seen that if the wing continues to produce the same amount of lift, the variations experienced in the independent values of V between the left and the right wings will have a direct influence on their respective values of CL, or angle of attack. As the value of V on the left-hand wing increases, the corresponding value of CL, the wing's angle of attack, will actually reduce. In contrast, but for the very same reason, where the value of V on the right-hand wing decreases, then the corresponding value of its CL will actually increase. So to paraphrase what I've just said, where bottom rudder is used to yaw the aircraft in the direction of the turn, the ultimate effect would be to reduce the angle of attack on the outboard wing, while at the same time increasing the angle of attack on the inboard. And in the case of Connie 808, this was sufficient, given all the other previous considerations, to push the angle of attack of the inboard right-hand wing to a value in excess of the critical value. The right-hand wing thus stalled, with an instantaneous loss of lift on that side. However, given that this technique had actually reduced the angle of attack on the left-hand wing, it, in contrast, was actually producing almost maximum lift at the very same time. This massive asymmetrical lift situation between the left and the right wings caused the aircraft to roll aggressively to the right and into the turn, leaving Chapo absolutely no chance whatsoever to recover. And this is exactly what the eyewitnesses had recounted. Given the landing weight of the aircraft at 236,000 pounds, the equivalent of 107,000 kilograms, with a landing flap setting of 50 degrees, the calculated manoeuvring speed for the approach would have been 170 knots. This manoeuvring speed ensuring a 50% buffer above the stall speed at a given 30 degrees angle of bank. The fact of the matter was that as Chapo called for flap 50, the aircraft's airspeed was already 20 knots below this value and continuing to decrease. In short, with that 20 knots eating into the mandated 50% safety margin, a 30-degree turn onto finals was always going to bring the aircraft dangerously close to the stall. An eyewitness account stated that Chapo had exceeded this value by a considerable amount. In truth, with the accumulative effect of all that was going on, at such a low altitude, and over a relatively short time duration, the crew of Connie 808 never really stood a chance. The question now was how, given their extensive piloting experience, had Chapo, Curran and Richmond allowed such a situation to develop in the first instance. As an aside, ever wondered why general aviation manufacturers in particular always mount the stall warning sensor on the left-hand wing? Well, the standard traffic pattern worldwide is left-hand, meaning that an aircraft intending to stay within the airport environment will be expected to make left turns around the circuit until eventually lining up with the landing runway once more. That being the case, were the pilot to input left rudder to help the aircraft around the turn from base to final, as we've seen in the case of Connie 808, the angle of attack of the inside wing, that being the left wing, would increase while that of the outside wing, or the right-hand wing, would decrease. Hence it was deemed sensible and prudent to have the sensor warning of the impending stall situated on the most critical side. The obvious danger is, however, if only one sensor is fitted, and that being on the leading edge of the left-hand wing, should the aircraft fly a right-hand pattern and the pilot implement the same technique in order to get around the corner, but this time in the opposite direction, the resultant stall may well occur without any prior oral warning being generated in the cockpit, as the sensor's location on the left wing may be recording a relatively healthy angle of attack value on that side, while at the same time the right-hand wing could actually be already stalled. Unbelievably, at the moment of impact, as the right wingtip gouged a deep furrow across the ground, and the aircraft cartwheeled in a huge fireball, the fuselage fractured just after the forward entry door, propelling the cockpit section forward like the broken tip of a pencil, clear of the main wreckage and the subsequent post-impact fire. A group of firefighters conducting a training exercise in the immediate area witnessed the crash firsthand and immediately rushed to the scene in order to search for survivors. Burning debris lay scattered over a huge area, and the spilled fuel was by now feeding a grass fire which was beginning to burn out of control. As they arrived on the scene, the firefighters quickly realised the fact that the remains of the cockpit had come to rest some distance away from the flames, and someone inside was calling out for help. Climbing in through a hole in the floor, they discovered all three seriously injured pilots, hanging sideways inside the mangled cockpit. One by one they extracted the three-man crew, all the while fending off the fire that had spread to several acres of grassland. Miraculously, Chapo, Curran and Richmond had all survived the experience. In a rare moment of diplomacy between the US and Cuba, American officials managed to secure permission for an air ambulance to directly cross Cuban airspace in order to rush the three pilots to hospitals in southern Florida. At the same time, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, had dispatched a GO team to Guantanamo Bay to determine the cause of the crash. Once recovered, they brought the black boxes back to Washington, D.C., where investigators listened to the cockpit voice recording for the first time. As they did so, they were astonished to hear Captain Chapo choosing to approach runway 10 just for the heck of it, a level of unprofessionalism totally unbecoming of his more than 20 years of flying experience. The light and variable surface winds meant that Chapo had the chance to land on runway 28. Indeed, the controller, using her own initiative, had actually offered it to him only minutes before the accident. Yet he had politely declined her offer. But why? Having reviewed the approach procedures for runway 10 in a full-flight DC-8 simulator, the investigators were of the belief that most pilots would have been unable to pull it off successfully in an aircraft of that size, without either manoeuvring the aircraft at unacceptable bank angles during the turn, or alternatively having been forced to widen the turn and thus overfly Cuban territory. Yet Chapo had pushed ahead, and those around him had offered up no objection as to what he was proposing to do. Again, the question was why. Furthermore, despite having agreed earlier that they would discontinue the approach and come back around for runway 28 should there be any unforeseen problems, Chapo had failed to do just that, and quite clearly Curran had obviously not seen it necessary to step in and intervene. Again, something the investigators found difficult to comprehend. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the crew's ability to accurately assess the potential threats posed by the approach onto runway 10 had been undoubtedly hampered given the general lack of information at their disposal. Most operators into Guantanamo carry on board briefing material in the form of a dedicated manual outlining the relevant operational considerations when flying into the base. These will most certainly highlight the unique challenges which the approach onto runway 10 presents. American International, however, did not. Furthermore, it was identified as a breakdown of standard operating procedures that the flight dispatcher in Norfolk had failed to provide Chapo and his crew with the mandatory pre-flight briefing covering operations into the base, because in his own words, he erroneously believed that all three were familiar with the operation and had flown into Guantanamo before, which for Chapo and Richmond was most definitely not the case. Thus, the only prior knowledge the crew would have had about the approach to runway 10 would have been from a training video they had watched more than 5 months previously, the content of which the NTSB believed did not adequately highlight the risks. But it wasn't until investigators began to scrutinise the pilot's duty schedule that their previously unanswered questions had finally begun to make sense. In retracing the crew's steps over the previous 24 hours, it became their suspicion that fatigue may well have had a significant part to play in the events of that August afternoon. In fact, at the time of impact, Chapo and Curran had been on duty for nearly 20 hours straight. Chapo had slept only 8 hours of the last 48 before the crash, half the amount he normally received. And during the same time frame, Curran had slept only 10 hours, which wasn't much better. And on top of all that, they had run night operations for the past 2 days, throwing off their normal sleep patterns. Research by NASA had shown that repeatedly failing to get enough sleep can cause a person to accrue a sleep debt, which has a compounding effect on fatigue. This fatigue in turn can cause significant reductions in a person's ability to process information, make decisions, and handle multiple simultaneous tasks. It was clear to the NTSB that the series of bizarre errors by an otherwise excellent crew could only have occurred due to fatigue, which made them feel sluggish and detached from reality. Unable to properly assess risk, it was believed that Chapo had decided to land on runway 10 instead of 28. Then once the approach had begun, he became fixated on the search for the strobe light that marked the Cuban border. Curran, for his part, had also become fixated on helping Chapo find the strobe, causing them both to tune out Richmond's repeated assertions that the speed was too low and that they weren't going to successfully make the turn. This fixation persisted with Chapo's continued attempt to make the final turn from a point way too close to the runway, rolling the aircraft to unacceptably high bank angles while at the same time in an energy-depleting state, and his fatal, perhaps subconscious decision to apply rudder in an effort to get the job done, all the result of being flat out on his feet, total and utter exhaustion. Post-accident interviews with the crew shed more light on how they were feeling at the time. Chapo described himself as a day person who had trouble with night shifts and didn't sleep well during the day. He had slept for maybe 4 hours during the layover in Dallas the previous day, and it wasn't high-quality sleep. His memories of the accident flight were foggy. He vaguely recalled Curran saying that he had doubts about the approach, but he couldn't remember any of the crew members' comments about their airspeed being too low, or that they weren't going to make it. This confirmed the investigator's suspicion that his fatigued brain had simply tuned them out. Reviewing the cockpit voice recording, in a statement to the NTSB, Chapo expressed consternation with his own behaviour.
It's very frustrating and disconcerting at night to try to lay there and think of how this, how you could be so lethargic when so many things were going on.
Curran, on the other hand, didn't remember feeling fatigued at the time. But after reviewing his performance on the cockpit voice recording, he said he thought he was probably more tired than he initially believed. The NTSB also looked into American International Airways and discovered many problems with the airline from an operational perspective. Their operations were spread over several US locations, as well as Saudi Arabia and South America. The FAA inspector assigned to oversee the airline complained that he wasn't given the funding to travel to these locations to see for himself how things were going. Indeed, just 2 weeks before the crash, the same inspector had sent a memo to his supervisors stating that he could not oversee all of the company's operations due to lack of funds. What he had seen of the operation to date, however, had already caused him some concern. He noted that the company had a tendency to go no further than the bare minimum required to comply with regulations, and that he often had to resort to unorthodox methods in order to get the company representatives to comply with his recommendations. Furthermore, he highlighted the fact that the relationship between pilots and the airline management was poor, and that repeated cases of abuse and verbal intimidation had pushed pilots to discuss the topic of unionization during the months leading up to the accident. The FAA inspector corroborated the pilots' complaints, testifying that company management were extremely profit-driven, and that pilots had reported numerous flight duty time violations, creating a culture whereby pilots were expected to accept whatever they were given, without regard for their own fatigue levels or those of the crew as a whole. Chapo stated that he had never heard of a company pilot refusing an assignment due to fatigue, and one pilot who had done so told the NTSB that afterwards he had been subjected to intimidation by his superiors. Curran, for his part, went on the record to say,
"If you had an objection to taking a trip, you could be in for a little bit of a conversation with the boss."
The problem was systemic, with company management also being under considerable pressure. The airline's contract with the Department of Defense was lucrative, but it was also demanding. The terms of the contract between the two allowed for the Department of Defense to penalise American International if flights were cancelled or indeed late leaving Norfolk. In an effort to keep the contract, the airline thus routinely pushed its pilots to the limit, frequently exploiting legal loopholes like the one that had allowed the crew of Flight 808 to complete the trip to Guantanamo Bay in the first instance. Furthermore, in an effort to reduce costs, the company's executives had tried to hire as few management-level staff as possible, forcing many to work jobs that should have been split between 3 or more people. As a result, compliance with regulations fell by the wayside, as personnel struggled simply to complete the day-to-day tasks needed to keep the airline running. At one point, the same FAA inspector became so frustrated with the company's inability to update its own flight operations manuals that he threatened to delay approval of the airline's newly established 747 operation until the matter was resolved. All of these factors were symptomatic of an airline that valued expansion and profit at the expense of its human employees, and it was inevitable that such a culture would at some point in the future be undermined. And on the afternoon of August 18th, 1993, that's exactly what had happened. At the conclusion of its investigation, the NTSB made the unprecedented decision to list pilot fatigue, not merely as a contributing factor, but as the probable cause of this accident. It was plain to the investigators that the crew was completely competent under normal circumstances, and that the accident would not have occurred in the first place if fatigue had not impaired their judgment. In its final report, the NTSB recommended that the FAA firstly close the loophole allowing airlines to exempt ferry flights from duty time limits. Secondly, that the FAA update its duty time regulations to take into account the latest research regarding fatigue. Third, that the FAA require airlines to teach pilots about the effects of fatigue. Fourthly, that American International Airways, from a training perspective, provide better crew resource management training to its pilots, and reinforce the aerodynamic consequences of operating aircraft at steep bank angles. And finally, that the Department of Defense brief all civilian contract pilots about procedures and hazards at designated special airports, like Guantanamo. Despite surviving the accident, the injuries each had received meant that life would never be the same again. Captain Jim Chapo suffered back injuries as a result of the impact, injuries which would force him to retire from flying. First Officer Tom Curran lost a leg in the crash, but despite this was able to continue flying for a period of time, before retiring and ironically becoming an investigator with the NTSB. Second Officer Dave Richmond managed to make a full recovery and return to his flying career, eventually working his way up to the rank of captain with Frontier Airlines in the US, until his retirement in 2018. Today, duty time limits for pilots in the United States are much stricter, and no pilot would ever be on duty for as long as the crew of Connie 808 were. Nevertheless, fatigue is a constant problem faced by any pilot flying night shifts, and every crew member must remain cognizant of their levels of tiredness at all times. Fatigue continues to play a role in crashes and near misses around the world, and the best thing a pilot can do to prevent a similar accident is to know his or her own limitations. In closing this chapter on the events surrounding Connie 808's demise on the shores of Guantanamo Bay, for all aviators watching, stop for a second and ponder the parting words of Captain Jim Chapo, who, but for the grace of God, survived his personal brush with the debilitating effects of exhaustion.
You know, I think about those things a lot, and I would want people to realize that it can happen to them. If you're fatigued, call it in.
In one final, incredibly ironic twist to the story of Connie 808, the investigation team learned that on the day of the accident, the by now infamous strobe light, the location of which had consumed so much of Chapo and Curran's attention, was in fact unserviceable. The official version of events, as outlined in the final NTSB report, which have admittedly been challenged by some, states that the tower controller, who on the day in question had been a supervised trainee, was not informed of this fact, and as such had never passed on this vital piece of information to the crew of 808. Had she? Well, just perhaps things may have been different. Perhaps.